Welcome back to KTN Sunrise Live. Just a look at our contact detail. You can send us an SMS to 8040. You could also send us an email to sunrise@standardmedia.co.ke or join the conversation on Twitter and or Facebook. If you're leaving the house and you really want to catch this interview, then you can catch the live stream. That's www.standardmedia.co.ke/KTN Live. Now, speaking of all this technology, the person who knows a lot about that is in the studio with me, Moses Kemibaro, the regional manager of Dealfish.com.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I was so scared of pronouncing your surname.
Many people have a problem with it.
All right. I'm glad to know I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
All right. So perhaps you can begin by telling us what it is that you do, and then we can tie it all to the whole conversation about, we can bring in corporates.
Okay, I've been in Kenya's internet sector now for probably about 15 years. From the very early days of connecting people to the internet on dial-up modems to where we are today, where I'm currently the regional manager for East Africa for Dealfish, which is an online classifieds website, Pan-African online classifieds website. Currently operational in Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and Ghana. At the same time, I'm also a blogger. You can go to my website, moseskemibaro.com, where I blog about technology. And generally, over the many, sort of 15 years, I've worked in many positions in different internet companies.
All right. In your experience, what would you say the trends are like of Kenyans on the internet, especially regarding consumption of products? Because a lot of reports tell us that this many Kenyans are on the net, this many Kenyans visit these sites, but they never tell us about consuming products.
Currently, there's an estimated 10 million internet users in Kenya. Many of those are set to go online through their mobile phones, as many as 50%. And if you look at statistics in terms of what they actually consume on the internet, a lot of it is actually social media. You'll find them on Facebook, they're on Twitter, they're on YouTube, and then you also find news sites like, the Standard Media. You'll find other sort of publications and so forth that are online. But a lot of the consumption is actually international websites. But interestingly enough, if you go to Facebook or Twitter, as much as the international social media sites, a lot of the actual content consumed is of a local nature. So you'll find people, connecting to each other, connecting to certain media personalities and so forth. So generally a lot of the activity is actually on social media.
Right. Now, speaking of social media, there's an article today in the Financial Journal saying that outdoor advertising is obviously taking a hard hit because of inflation, and a lot of people are opting to advertise on social networking sites. Is this true, and how is that working out for them?
Actually, if you look at Facebook, for instance, in Kenya, as well as even sites like LinkedIn, a lot of local companies, a lot of local brands are actually starting to advertise there. You'll find brands like, let's say, Bata for shoes. You'll find Safaricom very active on social media. A lot of other brands like banks, financial services, and so forth are actually taking advantage of social media. And I think digital media in general. So they'll also use Google and other popular websites. And I think a lot of this is driven by the fact that the cost of actually advertising and reaching an audience online is actually much, much lower than traditional media actually costs. The other thing to it is obviously it's also traceable, so you can see where the clicks are coming from, you can see the activity, how do they come to the site, what are they doing on the site, and how do they leave. So all that traceability and all that transparency of activity where marketing is concerned really is a key driver behind a lot of corporates and brands adopting social media and internet marketing in Kenya.
All right, let's talk about the big corporates. A company has been set up, or a multinational is setting up in Kenya, and they want to begin some activity on, say, Facebook and or Twitter. Where do you begin?
I'd have to say that if you wanted to gain maximum traction in Kenya, it's probably Facebook. First of all, I think there's somewhere in the region of about almost 1.3 million Kenyans using Facebook, which I think is a huge audience. If you think about it from percentages, that's at least 10% of internet users in Kenya. And that's where I think a lot of people are actually spending time. So in terms of marketing, obviously setting up a corporate profile on Facebook is key. You also have Facebook ads, so you can do advertising. But one of the things that we've noticed at Dealfish, for instance, is that as though you can do advertising on Facebook, it's a bit different from the way you do advertising, let's say, on Google. When you're using social media, a lot of the marketing has to be driven around conversation and engagement with your audience. So rather than just putting an ad and hoping people click through to your corporate website, you need to actually engage the audience in the conversations that go online on social media. And you'd be surprised that around even Kenyan brands, there are a lot of positive and negative conversations. And some brands are taking advantage of that. You look at what, say, we're doing with Dealfish. We talk to our audiences on Facebook and Twitter. You see what Safaricom is doing there, customer service. looking at sales and so forth, continuously and aggressively on social media. It's a different kind of marketing. It's more of a dialogue than a sort of a monologue, which your traditional marketing has been. And that's the difference, you see. You can go to Facebook and reach 1 million Kenyans, but the mode and style of communication is quite different.
All right. Should these companies perhaps have a different conversation within their premises to decide how is the social media is going to be run, who is going to be running it, what is going to be said? Should they have a point, or should it just be a site where, you can bring in your complaints, we're going to tell you what new products we have?
I think if you look, let's say, 2 to 3 years ago when social media was just gaining currency in Kenya, you find that there was a lot of skepticism. A lot of brands, especially corporates in Kenya, are very, very wary of using social media. But I think as it sort of gained momentum and the audiences are there, many of these brands have had to actually jump in and become a part of these conversations. The problem being, if you saw Safaricom, for instance, 2 years ago and what was happening on Facebook, I mean, they were getting hammered all the time. A lot of negative conversations, a lot of people complaining. But by jumping in there and actually investing resources and people to actually counter that sort of communication, you're able to deal with it. For instance, at Dealfish, what we do is on Twitter and Facebook, we're constantly monitoring our keywords. So if anybody puts out, Dealfish on Twitter, whether it's a negative or positive comment, we're constantly able to monitor that and respond. And the good thing about that is people then see you as a brand that is actually with it and responsive and actually part of the conversations, and not simply an outsider that wants to market by a monologue. You're actually engaging in the dialogue. So I would say that really a lot of brands and many, many more Kenyan brands and organizations need to jump in and actually become a part of these conversations and invest in platforms like social media.
Okay, going back to what you said about looking out for keywords on Twitter, Dealfish, to see what people are saying, what are some of the mistakes or what are some of the things that corporates and even small businesses are missing in terms of using social media?
I think a lot of them haven't had much experience in internet marketing or social media. So many of them, what they tend to do is to try and translate the offline experience or the traditional marketing approaches and putting them onto these digital medias. And that's not how it works. It's a completely different paradigm. It's a different mode of communication. And you tend to find, let's say, a marketer is simply plugging away and marketing a product or service. Is plugging away and possibly even being hostile to the people making negative comments. And the idea is that really the tone and slant of communication is much more informal, it's much more conversational, and the idea here being that one needs to, as a brand or as an organization, needs to assess exactly how best to do it. And in most cases, the best thing to do is actually have a social media expert on board or engage a firm that does that sort of thing and engage on social media in a manner that is consistent with that particular medium.
All right, but then I've had a lot of people say that the problem is you outsource somebody to come and handle your Twitter or Facebook accounts, and they're not able to comprehensively respond to some of the queries which are being raised about the company. So what happens then?
That's a very good point. I think in that sort of instance, really, then it usually would mean that there's a disconnect between, say, the traditional marketing functions within the organization and what's happening on digital media. And usually that's as a result of a lack of a sort of a comprehensive marketing strategy that includes both digital and offline. So by having an integrated approach, looking at the needs and coming up with a formal strategy for dealing with social media, your teams and customer service personnel should be able to do that and be empowered to actually respond accordingly. In many cases, usually there's a huge disconnect, and that's why you find that some people on social media responding for certain brands are unable to actually communicate effectively.
Right. So what are some of the rules? I mean, should you train a couple of people to be dealing with some questions? Should you give everyone in the company access to your social networking sites? What are some of the key rules?
I think just going by my own experience, I think you need to designate a champion, somebody who's really sort of switched on in terms of digital media. Secondly, I think you need to ensure that the business strategy or the marketing strategy for the overall business is also linked in aggressively to the online or digital strategy. Again, historically, many brands have not paid attention to the digital side. And you'll find that, in fact, in Kenya today, finding the personnel and people to do this kind of thing is actually quite easy. Many people know how to do it. But I think it's empowering the people, training them, and also giving them the necessary tools to manage social media. You find there are many softwares like TweetDeck, for instance, that simplify the process of monitoring your online activities for your brand. You also find there are practices like reputation management. Again, there are companies that specialize in this. They just help you manage and monitor brand conversations in social media around your brand. And not necessarily social media. and also some of the other digital medias available, like your Googles and so forth. What are people saying about you? If you look at the blogosphere in Kenya, for instance, there are thousands of blogs here, and it's quite incredible how many conversations go there. And as Dealfish, for instance, we constantly go online and actually respond on these blogs. We tell these people exactly what is happening, as opposed to them setting the opinion or the direction in terms of what the conversations are going to be. We actually jump in and respond accordingly. So again, a lot of it is also experimentation. There are no tried and proven paths per se. A lot of this stuff is really make it as you go along and improve on it over time. So at the same time, one learns a lot as they do it.
There's a perception that, the minute you hit digital media, then your company is set to make profits because you're reaching this huge audience and you're feeding them what you want them to hear. But is it possible for you to also make losses through digital media?
I think there are many cases globally. I remember there's one specific instance. I can't remember the brand, but there was a fast food chain in the US, and I think it might have been Burger King. And there was a very a classic case of how social media became critical. There was a video put on YouTube where some of the employees in a particular branch were doing some despicable things to the food. And, and this got out on social media. And immediately there was this massive boycott of Burger King as a brand, I think. And the people stopped actually going to the stores. And the corporate response was very interesting. They actually had to respond from the CEO level, put a video out countering the same negative publicity on YouTube, visiting a particular branch and indicating this is an isolated incident and not something that happens all over Burger King. I'm assuming it was Burger King. But the interesting thing there is that it can be both positive and negative. And the thing is, you can also come back from a negative scenario like the way this particular brand did and respond using the same social media to sort of recapture and re-engage your audiences and your customers. So again, depending on how you respond and how you act, social media really amplifies the ability for the average person to essentially take a knock on your brand. At the same time, it's also possible to amplify your reach using social media as a brand.
All right, based on your experience, obviously at Dealfish, and having worked obviously on the internet for what, 15 years now?
Yeah.
Would you say that we have reached a point where we can say this is all we can do on the internet, this is all we can do on social media, or can there more that can be done? Is there more that can be done?
Well, I've been in this space for a long time, and I think the most fascinating thing is, I remember probably as far back as 10 years ago, there are many things we're discussing then. We're talking about how e-commerce is going to happen very soon. At that time, we're talking about cables coming in a few years. It only happened a few years ago. That was 10 years ago we're talking about it. And what I have to say is that, the level of progress has not been as aggressive or as fast as we had hoped, 10 years ago. But what is very exciting right now is a lot of the promises, a lot of the potential that we saw then is now happening. You've got your 10 million internet users, you've got your 3, 4 fiber cables coming into Kenya, lots and lots of broadband. I think the mobile operators have been very key in sort of spreading out internet access and connectivity across the country. And when you look at all these factors and all these elements, everything is really almost aligned perfectly. For the very first time, you can really say there is possibility. We have the ICT Amendment Act, where you have the ability to do e-commerce. There are various providers already providing payment processing for credit cards and M-Pesa and so forth. So suddenly all these factors have come into play at the very right time. And I think, if anything, whatever we did for the last 10 years was just practice for what's about to happen.
Right.
And if you look at a lot of activity and news around Kenya in ICT, you'll find that Kenya really is being seen as one of the markets that is considered to be very progressive and has probably the most potential in the continent.
Now I'd like to welcome your SMSs and questions. Remember, you can send them in via 8040. We already have a couple. I'll start with the first one that came in. What does Kenya do to follow up on cyber crimes and punishing people who scam? How can one protect himself from that? That's Martin Homan. You didn't say where you're sending in your question from, but it does raise an important issue of security. I mean, if I'm in an institution, say a security firm, I don't want to risk sudden information leaking or being placed on the internet, or I don't want to risk someone hacking and pretending to be portraying my company in a negative image. How then do we then put stopgap measures?
Okay, again, by my experience, previously I was running a web design company just a year ago. And one of the things that we noticed very, very strikingly over the last couple of years is that since the fiber came in, there's a lot more hacking happening. a lot more corporate websites are being hacked. And in more cases than not, a lot of the hacking and security issues are not very complicated. It's usually a simple thing like the software used to build the site was outdated. And that means it has certain security holes, and people are then able to take advantage of that. So small things like, for instance, making sure that your website is built with the latest software is important. Making sure that you proactively upgrade the versions of software on your servers is also very important. You also find there are now security certified software people in the country, people who actually have learned how to secure and manage security systems. At the end of the day, for instance, the most basic thing, if you're not upgrading your antivirus regularly, then you open yourself up to risk. If you're not running a firewall, you open yourself up to risk. So many of the measures that you can take are really fairly basic. They're not very complicated. But then again, the moment we went onto the broadband and the high-speed, internet, we immediately became much more exposed to international hacking and international security, sort of cybercrime issues. And I think going forward, really, it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue. Just recently, I think you must have read in the news about the likes of Sony and so forth being hacked globally. These are well-known global brands that are also, getting hacked. So it is a very real risk, both at a local and international level. And I think the way around it is really just to make sure that you put all the measures in place to ensure that your risk is minimized.
And how do you make sure that the hacking doesn't come, number one, from your institution or from people you have outsourced? And is it expensive to keep updating the softwares that you keep mentioning?
Many of the softwares, if you bought the license, many of the upgrades are actually free, especially when you're buying new definitions for the software. In other instances, again, you're right. I mean, security-wise, if a password is fairly weak and is circulated amongst many people, then there's a very big risk of people easily hacking into the network or into the servers that run the websites and so forth. And again, I think the most important thing really is to have a proper security policy, an ICT security policy. Many organizations nowadays do this. So everything from how passwords are handled, policies that are set up on the sort of ICT infrastructure, monitoring how things are being done and used, and keeping very vigilant as to managing the risks that could come with cybercrime. And trust me, it's a very broad area. I mean, there are many types of risks that you find on a particular ICT infrastructure.
All right. Now, as we wind up, we've seen internationally some brands, I mean, just off the top of my head, the ones that I can think of, Starbucks have My Starbucks Idea, which is really big. Blendtec, who have these clips on YouTube where they constantly blend things, but they have massive following. Do we see any of our companies locally getting that sort of response for anything on the internet?
I think it's possible. I mean, the closest thing I can think of, especially with regards to social media that had huge visibility last year, was in March 2010, when there was this video for McMende. I don't know if they recall that, but for a very brief period there, I mean, people like the Wall Street Journal picked it up. The video had hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube, and I think the whole discussion and debate around it was probably the very first time that we saw what I call a viral sensation for a Kenyan social media initiative. Sad to say, nothing of that significance has happened to date, but the reality is that I think we have the potential to achieve some very interesting things. The guys on YouTube who make videos in their bedroom that achieve millions of views just because of the creativity and the spontaneity of
Don't
these videos.
jealous me. Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, is this one that I thought of the guy who made it in his bedroom and now he has a YouTube channel by himself?
Yes. So again, social media is the only place where one person can achieve an audience of millions, very easily. So anything is possible. It just takes creativity and I suppose some level of ingenuity to achieve that sort of outcome.
All right. And finally, how do you stay interesting? Because it's possible to set up a page on Facebook and then on Twitter get a huge following. How do you keep them captivated? How do you make sure that information is constantly circulating and it's fresh and it's with it?
I think a lot of it really is the basic stuff that people are into. One of the ways that people use social media quite effectively is running things like competitions, polls, continuously engaging your audience, asking them what they'd like to see, putting quirky stuff online, running interesting sort of campaigns that are interesting to your audience. And I think that's really the secret. Like you mentioned earlier, Starbucks. What does Starbucks do to have all those millions of Facebook friends? And you find that the level of activity and engagement on their Facebook page is actually very high. You look at brands like Safaricom in Kenya, they're making great headway. You look at some of the radio stations and so forth on Facebook and Twitter, and they're doing very, very well. So I think it's really about maintaining constant engagement, keeping it interesting, keeping it fresh, doing little competitions and so forth that engages the audience.
All right. Any final words before you leave? Thank you so much. I mean, you've been so informative so far, but anything else you would like to add?
Not at all.
Not at all? All right. Remember, you can catch him on his website, moseskemibaro.com.
Correct.
Thank you so much for coming in to the studio this morning and for your information. And you're also available on Twitter, I suppose?
Yeah, Twitter also is moseskemibaro.com. And
right.
Facebook too.
And on Facebook as well. Do you accept everyone or do you vet?
Not everyone in particular.
All right, thank you so much for coming into the studio this morning. We appreciate your time. If you have any more questions, 8040, or you can just, get in touch with Moses directly on his Twitter or on his blog, and I'm sure he'll be able to deal with your queries if at all you have any. We take a short break. When we come back, we look at some international news stories and a recap of some local stories. Do stay tuned.